On a sunny afternoon, an elderly black woman walked down the street holding her grocery bag. Her steps were steady, but her years of life's struggles were visible in her eyes. Suddenly, a police car pulled up next to her, and a white officer stepped out with a hardened look. He stared at her and said, "What are you doing here?" The woman, stunned, looked around, confused by the question. Little did the officer know that this was no ordinary woman. She was the mother of a man whose name commanded respect in every legal circle across the country. What happened next was so powerful that it not only shook the officer but left the entire town questioning their beliefs. Stay tuned as we dive deep into a story of prejudice, injustice, and the courage that turns everything around. Let us know where you are watching from in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and eye-opening stories. In a quiet neighborhood in the heart of the city, life moved at a slow pace. Most residents were familiar with each other, and the streets were filled with the warm buzz of a close-knit community. Among them was Eleanor Johnson, a 70-year-old black woman who had lived in the area for decades. Known for her kindness and wisdom, Eleanor was a widow who had raised her son, Malcolm, on her own. Malcolm was no ordinary man. He was a highly successful lawyer who had earned national recognition for fighting cases of racial injustice. Despite his fame and fortune, Malcolm always remained grounded, often reminding others that his mother was the true source of his strength and inspiration. Eleanor was proud of her son, but lived a simple life. She enjoyed her daily walks, chatting with neighbors, and shopping for fresh produce at the local market. On this particular day, Eleanor left her small, cozy home with her reusable shopping bag. She planned to buy some fresh vegetables for dinner. As she walked to the market, the sun shone brightly, and the neighborhood seemed as peaceful as ever. But just as she crossed the street near the park, a police car appeared out of nowhere. The car slowed down, and an officer stepped out. His name was Officer Greg Thompson, a man with a reputation for being strict and, according to some, unfairly targeting minorities. Dressed in his crisp uniform and sporting an authoritative demeanor, he walked straight toward Eleanor. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone sharp and suspicious. Eleanor stopped and looked at him, confused. "What are you doing in this area?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. Eleanor, holding her bag tightly, responded calmly, "I live here. I am on my way to the market." But Officer Thompson didn't seem convinced. "Do you have any identification?" he demanded. Eleanor's face showed her surprise. She had lived in this neighborhood for years, and no one had ever questioned her presence. "Why do I need to show you my ID? I have done nothing wrong," she replied firmly but politely. However, Thompson's expression hardened. His tone grew more aggressive, and he began accusing her of loitering. Eleanor, standing her ground, tried to explain herself, but the officer's behavior only escalated. A small crowd began to gather, sensing that something was not right. Little did Officer Thompson know that Eleanor was not someone to be underestimated. The quiet, elderly woman he was harassing was the mother of a man who had spent his entire career fighting for justice. What happened next would not only expose the officer, but also spark a conversation that would echo far beyond this neighborhood. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk, her reusable shopping bag clutched tightly in her hand. Officer Greg Thompson's sharp gaze bore into her. The small crowd that had gathered could feel the tension in the air. Despite being an elderly woman, Eleanor's calm yet firm demeanor revealed her inner strength. "Ma'am, I am not asking again. Show me your ID," Officer Thompson demanded, his voice loud enough for onlookers to hear. Eleanor raised her chin and replied, "I have told you, I am on my way to the market. I live nearby. Why do I need to show you anything?" The officer's demeanor turned even more aggressive. "You look suspicious, walking around this area without any purpose," he said. "Suspicious?" Eleanor repeated, her voice unwavering. "This is my neighborhood. Are you questioning me because of my skin color?" Thompson, now visibly irritated, ignored her question and reached for her shopping bag. "What are you hiding in here?" he asked, trying to grab it from her hands. Eleanor stepped back, her eyes blazing with indignation. "You have no right to search my belongings. I have done nothing wrong." By this time, the small crowd had grown larger. People began murmuring among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the incident. A young woman in the crowd whispered to her friend, "That's Eleanor. She has lived here for years. This is wrong." Thompson, oblivious to the growing attention, continued to accuse Eleanor. "You people think you can walk around and do whatever you want without consequence," he sneered. Eleanor froze at the words, the blatant racism cutting through the air. Despite the humiliation, Eleanor stayed composed. "I will not be intimidated by your behavior, officer," she said, her voice steady. But Thompson wasn't listening. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the patrol car. Gasps erupted from the crowd as Eleanor struggled to free herself. "Let her go!" a voice shouted from the back of the crowd. It was a young man named Andre, who often helped Eleanor with her groceries. He stepped forward, his phone raised, recording everything. "You're harassing an innocent woman. This is unacceptable," he yelled. Thompson turned to Andre, his grip on Eleanor tightening. "Step back, or you'll be next," he barked. But Andre didn't move. Instead, he shouted to the crowd, "Everyone, keep recording. This is wrong, and we all know it." Eleanor, though shaken, managed to speak. "I am not alone. The truth will come out," she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. And she was right. At that moment, a luxury car pulled up to the curb. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit. The crowd parted as he approached. It was Malcolm, Eleanor's son. His calm yet authoritative presence silenced the murmurs. "Officer, unhand my mother immediately," Malcolm said, his voice low but commanding. Thompson turned, startled by the interruption. "And who might you be?" he asked with a sneer. Malcolm reached into his pocket and pulled out his ID. The crowd leaned closer, trying to catch a glimpse. "I am Malcolm Johnson, civil rights attorney," he said, his tone steady. "And this woman you are harassing is my mother." The crowd erupted in whispers, some cheering softly. Thompson's face paled, the weight of his actions slowly dawning on him. He released Eleanor's arm and stepped back, his confidence shattered. Eleanor looked at her son with pride and relief. Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning back to the officer. "We are not done here," he said. "You will be held accountable for this disgraceful behavior." The crowd watched in awe as the tables began to turn. Thompson, who had started the day with arrogance and authority, now stood before a man whose calm strength and legal expertise promised justice. The onlookers knew that what they had witnessed was just the beginning of a story that would leave a lasting impact. The tension in the air was thick as Malcolm stood face to face with Officer Thompson. The crowd, now numbering over 24, watched intently. Phones were pointed at the scene, capturing every word and action. Malcolm's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Thompson's visible discomfort. "I would like an explanation, officer," Malcolm said, his tone measured but firm. "Why is my mother being treated like a criminal?" Thompson, attempting to regain his composure, replied, "She was acting suspiciously. I was simply following the procedure." "Procedure," Malcolm repeated. "Since when does walking to the market warrant this level of harassment? She has lived in this neighborhood longer than you have been an officer." His voice carried an air of authority that made Thompson hesitate. The officer glanced at the crowd and then back at Malcolm. "I don't need to justify my actions to you," he muttered. But his voice lacked the confidence it had moments earlier. Eleanor, standing beside her son, looked directly at Thompson. "You owe me an apology," she said firmly. The crowd murmured in agreement. Malcolm took a step closer to the officer, holding up his phone. "This entire interaction has been recorded," he said. "The moment you laid hands on my mother without cause, you crossed a line. You are accountable for your actions." Thompson's face reddened. "I was doing my job," he said defensively. "Your job is to serve and protect," Malcolm countered, "not to target and intimidate based on prejudice." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. One bystander shouted, "That's right." Others began chanting, "Justice for Eleanor." The officer looked around nervously, realizing he was outnumbered and under scrutiny. At that moment, another police car arrived on the scene. A senior officer stepped out, his expression stern. Sergeant Davis, known in the community for his fair judgment, quickly assessed the situation. "What's going on here?" Davis asked, his gaze shifting from Thompson to Malcolm and then to Eleanor. Malcolm turned to the sergeant and introduced himself. "I am Malcolm Johnson, civil rights attorney. This is my mother, Eleanor Johnson. She was harassed and manhandled by this officer without cause." Davis frowned and turned to Thompson. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone sharp. Thompson stammered, "She refused to show her ID. I was just trying to ensure public safety." Eleanor interjected, her voice steady. "I refused because there was no reason to ask for it. I was walking to the market, as I have done for years. He stopped me and accused me of being suspicious." The sergeant's face hardened. "Thompson, we are not here to target innocent citizens," he said firmly. "Your behavior reflects poorly on this department." Malcolm seized the moment. "Sergeant, I expect an immediate investigation into this incident," he said. "Not just for my mother, but for the community that deserves better from its officers." The sergeant nodded. "Mr. Johnson, you have my word. This will be addressed." Thompson, now visibly shaken, tried to justify himself. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just doing my job." Malcolm looked him directly in the eye. "Your actions were harmful. Ignorance is not an excuse." The crowd cheered again, their voices echoing down the street. The shift in power was clear. Eleanor, who had been humiliated moments earlier, now stood tall beside her son, a symbol of resilience and dignity. As Sergeant Davis instructed Thompson to return to the station for questioning, Malcolm turned to the crowd. "This is not just about my mother," he said. "It is about standing up against injustice wherever we see it. Together, we can hold those in power accountable." The onlookers erupted in applause. Some approached Eleanor to offer words of support, while others vowed to share the footage they had captured. The community's unity in that moment was undeniable. Eleanor looked up at her son, her eyes filled with pride. "Thank you, Malcolm," she said softly. "You have always stood for what is right." Malcolm smiled and placed an arm around his mother. "You taught me that," he replied. The scene ended with Thompson being driven away in the patrol car, his head hung low. Eleanor and Malcolm stood surrounded by their supportive community, a powerful reminder that justice can prevail when people unite against wrong. The next morning, the video of the incident was everywhere. Social media platforms were flooded with hashtags like Justice for Eleanor and Stop Racial Profiling. The community's outrage grew louder as the story gained momentum. News outlets picked it up, with headlines highlighting the injustice Eleanor faced. Malcolm woke up to dozens of messages from reporters, activists, and concerned citizens. Everyone wanted to know more about the case and how they could help. Malcolm, realizing the opportunity to make a broader impact, decided to hold a press conference that afternoon. Eleanor, still shaken but resolute, sat beside her son in their living room. "Do you think this will really change anything, Malcolm?" she asked quietly. "It has to, Mom," Malcolm replied. "This is about more than just us. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." By noon, a small crowd had gathered outside the community center where the press conference was to take place. Cameras flashed as Malcolm and Eleanor walked in, their heads held high. Malcolm began the conference with a brief recount of the events, ensuring he emphasized the systemic issues at play. "This is not an isolated incident," he said firmly. "It is part of a larger problem that continues to plague our society. My mother was harassed and humiliated for no reason other than the color of her skin. This is unacceptable, and we will not stand for it." The reporters hung on to every word. Eleanor, who had been hesitant to speak, finally stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but filled with conviction. "I have lived in this neighborhood for decades. I have seen it change, grow, and thrive. But I have also seen how people like me are treated differently, with suspicion and hostility. That must end now," she said. As the press conference continued, Malcolm announced that he would be filing a formal complaint against Officer Thompson and the department. "We are seeking accountability," he said, "not just for my mother, but for every person in this community who has ever been wronged." The crowd erupted in applause. It was clear that this was not just a fight for Eleanor. It was a fight for everyone who had faced similar injustices. As the day went on, more details about Officer Thompson began to surface. Several individuals came forward, sharing their own stories of being unfairly targeted by him. Each account added fuel to the fire, painting a picture of a man who had used his badge as a weapon of intimidation. The police department, now under immense public pressure, released a statement acknowledging the incident and announcing that Thompson had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. Malcolm's phone buzzed with a call from Sergeant Davis. "Mr. Johnson, I want to assure you that this matter is being taken very seriously," Davis said. "I appreciate that, Sergeant," Malcolm replied, "but words are not enough. The community needs to see real change." That evening, a community meeting was held at the local church. The turnout was overwhelming, with people of all backgrounds coming together to support Eleanor and demand action. Malcolm stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd. "This is not just about one officer," he said. "It is about a system that allows this behavior to go unchecked. We must hold them accountable, but we must also work to create lasting change." The energy in the room was palpable. People began sharing their own experiences, some tearfully recounting moments of discrimination and humiliation. Eleanor listened intently, her heart heavy but also filled with hope. And by the end of the meeting, the community had formed a plan of action. They would organize protests, petition for policy changes within the police department, and ensure that Officer Thompson faced the consequences of his actions. Malcolm and Eleanor returned home late that night, exhausted but encouraged. "You know, Malcolm," Eleanor said as she sat on the couch, "I never imagined something like this would happen to me. But I am so proud of how you are turning it into something bigger, something meaningful." Malcolm smiled. "This is only the beginning, Mom. Together, we can make a difference." As they turned on the television, they saw a news anchor discussing the story. The footage of the incident played on the screen, followed by clips from the press conference. The anchor concluded, "This incident has sparked a national conversation about racial profiling and accountability within law enforcement. It is a stark reminder of the work that still needs to be done." Eleanor leaned back and closed her eyes. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. The journey was far from over, but she knew they were on the right path. The day after the press conference, the story of Eleanor and her son Malcolm became a national sensation. The video of the incident, along with footage from the press conference, was shared millions of times across social media platforms. Hashtags like "Yes, Justice for Eleanor" and "End Police Bias" trended for days. News outlets and television programs featured discussions about the event, sparking a national debate about racial profiling and systemic injustice. The outcry was swift and unrelenting. Local and national activists joined forces, organizing protests outside the police department. Hundreds of people gathered, carrying signs that read, "Stop Racial Profiling" and "Justice for All." The sound of chants filled the air, echoing through the streets as people of all races and backgrounds united to demand accountability. Eleanor watched the coverage from her living room, overwhelmed by the support. "I never thought so many people would care," she said quietly to Malcolm. "Mom, this is bigger than us," Malcolm replied. "This is about changing the system." Meanwhile, the police department was under intense scrutiny. The mayor issued a statement expressing concern about the incident and pledging to ensure a thorough investigation. "This type of behavior does not represent our city," the statement read. However, the department's initial response was met with skepticism. Community leaders pointed out that similar promises had been made in the past, yet little had changed. Malcolm decided to escalate their efforts, meeting with local officials to push for tangible reforms. During these meetings, Malcolm presented a list of demands, including mandatory bias training for officers, independent oversight of complaints against the police, and a review of existing policies. "We need more than just apologies," Malcolm said firmly. "We need action." As the protests grew, more people came forward with their own stories about Officer Thompson. One man recounted being stopped and searched while walking home from work. A young woman tearfully shared how Thompson had humiliated her in front of her children during a routine traffic stop. Each story painted a damning picture of a man who had abused his power for years. The pressure on the police department continued to mount. Civil rights organizations joined the fight, offering legal support to Malcolm and Eleanor. Prominent figures began speaking out, using their platforms to amplify the story and call for change. One evening, a town hall meeting was held to address the community's concerns. The room was packed, with standing room only. Eleanor, hesitant at first, decided to attend. As she walked in, the crowd erupted in applause, a show of solidarity that brought tears to her eyes. Malcolm stood at the podium, addressing the audience with a calm but powerful demeanor. "This is not just about my mother," he said. "This is about every person who has been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. It is about a system that protects those in power at the expense of justice." The room fell silent as Malcolm's words resonated with everyone present. One by one, people stood up to share their own experiences, each story a testament to the pervasive issue of racial bias. Eleanor listened intently, her resolve strengthening with every account. Outside the town hall, protesters continued to demand answers. The crowd had grown larger, spilling into nearby streets. News cameras captured the scene, broadcasting the unfolding events to viewers across the country. Faced with overwhelming public backlash, the police department was forced to act. An internal investigation into Officer Thompson's conduct was launched, and he was placed on unpaid leave. The chief of police held a press conference, acknowledging the department's failure and promising reforms. "We are committed to rebuilding trust with our community," the chief said. "This incident has highlighted the need for change, and we are taking steps to ensure accountability." But for Malcolm and Eleanor, words were not enough. They continued to push for action, meeting with lawmakers to advocate for legislation aimed at addressing racial bias in law enforcement. Their efforts began to bear fruit. A bill was introduced in the state legislature that called for increased transparency and accountability within police departments. The bill, dubbed the Eleanor Act, aimed to prevent incidents like this from happening again. As the weeks went on, the protests gradually subsided, but the fight for justice was far from over. Malcolm remained focused on their mission, using the momentum to drive lasting change. Eleanor, though still shaken by the experience, found strength in the support of her community and the determination of her son. One evening, as Malcolm was preparing for another meeting, Eleanor approached him. "I never wanted any of this attention," she said, "but I am so proud of what you're doing. You're making a difference." Malcolm smiled. "I learned from the best," he replied. As they watched the evening news, a segment aired about the impact of their efforts. The anchor highlighted the progress being made, including the proposed legislation and the ongoing investigation into Officer Thompson. Eleanor and Malcolm sat in silence, reflecting on how far they had come. Their journey was a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what is right. The community had rallied behind them, turning a moment of injustice into a movement for change. And while there was still much work to be done, they knew they had already made a lasting impact. As the public backlash reached its peak, change began to take shape. The pressure from protests, media coverage, and Malcolm's relentless advocacy forced the city and the police department to take concrete steps. Eleanor and Malcolm were invited to meet with the mayor and city officials. The mayor expressed deep regret for the incident and assured them that real changes would be made. Malcolm, however, remained cautious. "Words mean nothing without action," he said firmly. One of the first steps was introducing mandatory bias training for all officers in the department. This training was designed to address systemic issues and help officers recognize and correct their prejudices. Officer Thompson, who had been placed on leave, was required to attend these sessions. Thompson, initially defensive, began to reflect on his actions. As he sat through the training, listening to stories from people who had experienced discrimination, he started to understand the impact of his behavior. For the first time, he realized the pain he had caused. In a surprising turn, Thompson requested a meeting with Eleanor and Malcolm. Hesitant but willing to hear him out, they agreed. Sitting across from them, Thompson looked down, his voice shaky. "I am sorry," he said. "I see now how wrong I was. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say this." Eleanor, her voice calm but firm, replied, "It is not about forgiving you. It is about ensuring this never happens to anyone else." Malcolm added, "This apology is a step, but the real work starts with the system changing." Meanwhile, the Eleanor Act, a bill introduced in the state legislature, gained momentum. It called for independent oversight of police misconduct cases, mandatory use of body cameras, and increased transparency in hiring practices. Malcolm worked tirelessly with lawmakers to ensure its passage, attending meetings and rallies to garner support. As the movement grew, Eleanor decided to share her story publicly. She spoke at schools, churches, and community events, emphasizing the importance of standing up against injustice. Her quiet strength and grace inspired many, turning her into a symbol of resilience and hope. At one event, Eleanor told the crowd, "I never wanted to be in this position, but sometimes life pushes you to fight for what is right. This fight is not just for me. It is for every mother, every son, and every person who has been treated unfairly." The community responded with overwhelming support. Donations poured in to fund initiatives aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Malcolm used these funds to establish the Justice and Unity Foundation, focusing on promoting equality and fostering understanding. In time, the police department began to see changes. Officers who had once been dismissive of complaints began to approach their jobs with more empathy. Community policing programs were implemented, encouraging officers to engage with residents and build trust. Malcolm and Eleanor continued their advocacy, but they also took time to heal. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Eleanor looked at her son and said, "You turned something terrible into something meaningful. I am so proud of you." Malcolm smiled. "We did it together, Mom. And this is just the beginning." Though the journey was far from over, their efforts had already left a lasting impact. Their story was a powerful reminder that even in the face of adversity, resilience and unity could drive real change. Eleanor and Malcolm's story became a beacon of hope and a call for justice. What began as a moment of injustice transformed into a movement for change. Their journey reminded people everywhere that speaking out, even when it is difficult, can lead to a better future. In the months that followed, the changes they fought for started to take root. The Eleanor Act passed with overwhelming support, becoming a symbol of progress. Other cities began adopting similar measures, inspired by their courage. Eleanor's quiet strength continued to inspire. She was often invited to share her story on television and at community events. Her message was simple but powerful. Every voice matters. Never let anyone make you feel invisible. Malcolm's work with the Justice and Unity Foundation grew rapidly. The foundation launched programs that brought communities and police together, fostering understanding and collaboration. One of their most impactful initiatives was a mentorship program for young people, teaching them about leadership and activism. One sunny afternoon, Eleanor and Malcolm visited a school to speak with students. Eleanor looked at the sea of eager faces and said, "Never doubt your worth. You have the power to change the world, no matter who you are or where you come from." The students erupted into applause, moved by her words. As they left the school, Malcolm turned to his mother. "You are incredible," he said. Eleanor smiled and replied, "It is not just me. It is us, and everyone who stood with us." Their story ended not with bitterness, but with hope. It showed that even in the darkest times, light can shine through when people stand together. To the world, Eleanor and Malcolm became a symbol of resilience. To each other, they were simply family, stronger than ever, ready to face whatever came next. What would you do in a situation like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.